You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Hello and welcome to TFM's local watering hole, coming at you from Rick's in Casablanca. That's right. We've hopped over the pond and are enjoying a wonderful drink here in this fine establishment. And I'm so excited to have back with me the one and only Zachary Fruhling. Zachary, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. You know, the 602 Club is kind of like Rick's. Everybody comes to the 602 Club.
It's true. It's true. You know, it's funny because on Warp 5, Chris and I were just recording the episode on First Flight. It's one of the biggest episodes, of course, where we really see the 602 Club. We get a chance to really hang out in it a bunch. And so, absolutely. No, I mean, that's the place where all the Starfleet brats would go and brass as they get off shift and go hang out. So absolutely 100%. And I love it that we're here tonight. And it's really fun because this is for me a very special movie. And so when Zachary and I were trying to think of things that we wanted to discuss, I have a birthday coming up, and I thought, well, why don't I talk about a movie that really means a lot to me? And so we're going to do that tonight. But before we do that, before we dive into the best gin joint in all the world, you can find us all over the place on social media. We would appreciate if you would interact with us and follow us on those places. Twitter, of course, at the 602 Club. We're on Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. There's that new Threads thing you can find us at as well, 602 Club TFM. You can find the entire network, Trek.fm. Of course, we've got Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM, the entire network there. Babel Conference you can join over on Facebook and talk to listeners from all over the world. And you've got our website, Trek.fm, where you can see all of the shows we're doing. And if you do like what we do here, we would really appreciate it if you would help us out by going over to Patreon at patreon.com/TrekFM and become part of our team. Make sure that all of these shows can keep coming to you each and every week. You know, it's very expensive to do this, and we can't do it without listeners just like you. So again, that is patreon.com/TrekFM. Plus, you know, we always tell you this, but if you're not subscribed to the show wherever you're listening, please subscribe to the show, and you'll be able to listen to all the episodes as soon as they drop. And you can help us out by, you know, giving us a shout out, star rating, review on a place like, you know, Apple Podcasts or Spotify and those kind of things. All of that said, I'm really interested, Zach, to hear what your history with this movie is, because, of course, you know, this is a film that was released in 1942, and so it has been around for a very long time. And so, is this something you grew up with? Is this your first time?
I'm really interested to see what meeting of the minds we have here, because I think we come at this movie from such different angles. You told me previously that this is your favorite movie. Am I right about that? And we're talking about it because it's your birthday tomorrow, and it's your favorite movie. So this is a birthday present to you. Happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you.
In contrast, I have never seen Casablanca until the day before yesterday, ever. So I have no attachment to this movie whatsoever. And I'd like to think I bring some fresh eyes to it. And I was looking through the show notes that you put together, and I think you and I take away some slightly different things from this movie. So I'm looking forward to doing a little compare and contrast and see what we come up with.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really fun. Like you said, this has definitely been my favorite movie for the longest time. You know, just as I was growing up and kind of getting a cinema education, this not only became my favorite movie, but I would argue to me is probably the best movie ever made, is my opinion. There's just so much about this movie that I think not only works and clicks, but has become just so iconic and so longing to be copied by other people. And, it became one of those benchmark films in the ways in which writing, character development, all of that kind of stuff you would see copied in later films, and other films try to, I think, mimic it. Another film that I always think of, that's really old, that's like that, is It Happened One Night with Clark Gable, which is kind of the quintessential romantic comedy. And so many films have kind of followed the same type of formula that it created, and to, create films ad nauseum in that genre. And you would see many of those types of things copied in many films, or at least paid homage to. And I think, that's one of the interesting things about Casablanca, is it's definitely become that. I mean, with a film this old.
It's also one of those movies that other movies will talk about or reference. I mean, I think there's a movie called Play It Again, Sam, isn't that right? That is about someone who's a fan of Casablanca. And I remember when Harry Met Sally spent some time talking about Casablanca. That was my sole introduction to Casablanca until recently. Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's one of the places, too, that I remember seeing it heavily referenced, as they're watching it, as they're falling asleep at night, talking on the phone, and they're repeating the lines of the film to each other because, again, it's such a classic film. And so they also talk about whether it's better for, is it Ilsa, I think, to stay with Rick, or to get on the plane at the end of the movie, right?
Exactly. They have the whole conversation about that. Absolutely. So it's
depends what you want out of life.
Right. I mean, for your movie to still be argued about, that long after it's been made is pretty impressive. And it's a test. Are you a romantic or are you a cynic, right? Exactly. Or are you something else? Which I think that, there's something kind of in between their take. So that we'll talk about later. But, it's interesting to me too, because this movie's history is so fascinating. This was a film that was based on an unproduced play called Everybody Comes to Rick's. And at the time, it was the most that anybody had paid for an unproduced film of $20,000. But on top of that, I mean, this is a movie that, we're in the Hollywood system, right? We're in the studio system. And this was just another film in the end. It went through a bunch of writers, and this was not meant to be necessarily, I think, anything special. Right? Which it doesn't feel like a special movie, actually. As I watch the movie, I mean, it's a classic movie now in retrospect, but I didn't get the sense in watching the movie that it was produced as a classic. No, I think you're right. I mean, I think in many ways, this is a film that is produced just the way that all the other Hollywood studio films at that point are being produced. You do have an A-list cast in this film, which I think helps. A lot of the cast of this film is also in The Maltese Falcon, which was an incredible film as well. In fact, much of this cast is in The Maltese Falcon, so it's an incredible double bill if you're ever interested to kind of get that perspective. But no, I think you're absolutely right. Nobody's making this movie thinking we're making a classic. It's being put through the meat grinder of the studio system, just like every other film really is at that point. And so I wanted to ask you, because of your perspective coming into this, why do you think this movie has found an audience this many years later, where people are still talking about this movie? It's still on the best of lists, Hollywood's top 100 list. It's very far up there. What is it? Why are we still talking about Casablanca? To some extent, I think it has to do with the fact that the characters are, to some extent, caricatures. Rick is extremely cynical, and
the Nazis are extremely Nazi. It's a very, I don't know, it's not a subtle film. It plays the stereotypes really well. And also, this is something I didn't realize until I watched the film, but I didn't realize how many famous lines that I already knew actually came from Casablanca. I guess I knew that, but I never really thought about it. It's just quotable. Play it again, Sam. And here's looking at you, kid. And I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And we'll always have Paris. And boy, these lines just stick with you. And it may boil down to that, really, for me.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing because I think that it lasts. And you know, you mentioned the fact that these feel like characters, but I think one of the things that I always have to remember when I'm watching a film of this generation is that we don't have all the film history then that we have now. Mm-hmm. And so for many people, this type of film is revolutionary, especially back then, because, you know, this is a movie that deals with some, I would say, you know, moral ambiguity in a way that most films don't play with in that time period. So I think that's one of the things that sets this film apart. And you mentioned the classic lines. You know, I think that the reason we continue to talk about it is because of the way these actors deliver these lines makes them iconic. You know, we often forget, I think these days, the star power of a movie star, which, you know, Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman were absolutely at that time. And so their ability to like carry things. And I think my wife was asking me about this last night, and I think what makes it last and makes it iconic is that almost every single scene has one of those lines that you're talking about. It has shots that people have tried to mimic for years. It has a setup and storytelling that people have tried to create again and again, over and over, because they feel like this is so well done. And, you know, they say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? And I think that's one of the things about this film is it lasts because it's one that people have tried to imitate for so long. And therefore, that's the other thing that's kind of helped it live in our, you know, collective consciousness.
Well, I think you hit on something that that the movie plays like a play. It's designed to elicit audience reaction, scene by scene, line by line, just like you would in a stage production.
Which, I mean, it's one of those things where people kind of forget how limited filmmaking was at the time. And so most films of that time period are very much living up to their name that they had earned, the talkies, right? All of these old films are based on dialogue, not intense action, right?
Which is still fairly new. I mean, you know, within 20 years or so.
Yes, exactly. And so, no, I think you've hit on that very well. And so, and I think one of the other things to me that as I was watching the film the other night and I was just kind of playing through things in my head, you know, I think one of the things that this film does very well is within the first 5 minutes of the movie, setting up the world of Casablanca from the very start and introducing us to the characters, the way they weave all these storylines together. I was actually, again, impressed as I was kind of like looking at the film pretty intently, the way that happens. I mean, even all these tiny little side characters in that introduction, you know, as the narrator is telling us about why all these people are here in Casablanca, you know, you're already seeing characters that you're going to see the rest of the film, and it's slowly going to bring you into their stories as everything here just kind of interweaves itself together.
It's such a creature of its time. I mean, the 20th century in general was a century of this duality of civility and barbarism, right? Think of all the progress that was happening, how civil things could be in the 20th century, but we had 2 world wars and Vietnam, and things were really, really chaotic. And this movie seems to tap into the zeitgeist of the time, I think. The world is completely out of control, and yet we live in the civilized part of the world, and French Morocco seem to have the that duality of, a civilized environment inside the bar, but extreme barbarism right outside the doors. Mm-hmm. Sometimes in the doors.
Well, yeah, and I mean, something that we'll talk about, but some of the thematic elements that kind of come up in the film that it's asking, different questions in the midst of a time where people are asking their own big questions. I mean, this movie's made and released in 1942 at Hollywood Theater there, and the wide releases in 1943. So, I mean, people are, reeling, like you said, with the being in the middle of World War II. And I think this movie...
it's a situation of being out of control, right? I mean, the world is at war, and if you're not literally, a person with a rifle on your shoulders, think how out of control you really are. You don't have the ability to influence world events. You're kind of waiting for your fate to be handed to you. And I think the thing that I found most interesting in the way that Rix is portrayed is that it's a waiting place. Like, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. No one knows what the outcome's going to be. There's are the Nazis going to be victorious? Are the Americans going to be victorious? Can we get to America? Can we not get to America? We're going to be stuck in Casablanca forever. And what do? You wait at Rix and try to find some meaning in the middle of it all.
Well, and I think, you hitting on that. I mean, the whole beginning of the film is the narration, and then it ends with, and wait, and wait. Because, everybody is there just waiting to get out of this place, but they don't know if that's ever going to happen. And therefore, you end up with the most interesting collection of people on screen and, in the story, because all of these people have been thrown together by the complete and utter destruction of their normal lives because of what's happening in Europe at the time. And
even their riches and wealth and influence don't seem to get them out of Casablanca.
Exactly. I think that it's just, when we think about the way the film sets itself up, just as a quick example for anyone kind of listening, I think one of the things, like the story of the young couple who are trying to get out of Casablanca, and you see them very early in that opening with the narration, and then they slowly kind of progress out of the background of the story into the story. And then they become very much involved with all of our main characters, from Rick to Captain Renault, and it's actually that action that Rick takes there that kind of helps us see a little bit into the soul of that character, right?
It's either central to his character growth, or it's central to the revelation of what his character really is.
Exactly. So the film setup, though, I think is just so incredibly smart in the way that it is interweaving all these characters. Because, too, the setup of this really, in many ways, it's almost anthology, right? It's almost anthology-like, right? Because all of these stories are loosely connected and yet very different from one another, but they all have a central focus of course, what the film was called originally as an unproduced play, Everybody Comes to Rick's. And it all revolves around this place where, none of these people have anything in common other than the fact that they want to get the heck out of Dodge.
Yeah, it's like being in Billy Joel's The Piano Man or something. All the interesting cast of characters that wind up in this bar somehow.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. I love that. Billy Joel's Piano Man. So, no, I think that, which I also think is one of the things that, as we were asking the question of what makes this enduring, I think that the film setup is actually one of the things that helps in that, because as you have the ability to rewatch the film over and over again, you're able to focus on all these little side stories as much as you might the main stories that are going on, and see how they all play out. It kind of reminds me of the way in which Quarks becomes Ricks on Deep Space Nine.
Absolutely. I was thinking of that. Even the way that Quark says, "Welcome Klingons." Remember when he unfolds the banner, "Welcome Klingons." Yes. He's going to go where the winds blow. That is Rick, right? It's the same situation.
Exactly. Well, and it's exactly what Captain Renault says too, right? Mm-hmm. I have no convictions. I go where the wind blows. And Quark is very much that character. So, I mean, even in Star Trek, we see this being referenced. And so I think, it is something to which that's why this film continues to captivate people and why I think people continue to watch it.
But nonetheless, I didn't find it a very inspiring film, to be honest. I mean, it has this latent nihilism throughout it. I mean, the events of the world are completely indifferent to the fates of these characters in the film. They seem completely out of control. The characters seem to largely lack a moral compass, seeming willing to go where the winds blow. Of course, by the end, we see a little deeper into Rick, but the nihilism of the film doesn't really get resolved by the end of the film. So I just didn't find it a very inspiring film.
That's really interesting because I would completely disagree with you because I think that this movie is all about the redemption of Rick. I think this film is clearly showing that, he's lost a sense of anything, right? Other than surviving. That's his MO. And he's become that person who not willing to fight for anything other than himself. Like you said, he's completely cynical and jaded. And that's a juxtaposition who we were told he was before, he had his experience with Elsa. Right.
But I didn't get the sense that he was particularly less jaded by the end of the film. Yes, he does a couple good actions and he pairs up with Louis and they're ready to see what they can get away with by the end of the movie.
Well, but I see that's where I would disagree with you because he is willing to sacrifice the love of his life for what's better. And he knows that Victor Laszlo escaping is going to be better for the world at large than if he escapes with Ilsa. And by doing that, he is giving the world a better chance to be able to defeat the enemy that we've seen throughout the entire film. And, even the movie itself juxtaposes, the German national anthem with this film is laced with the French national anthem all the time. And that was clearly done to, I think, kind of drive that point home. And I also think, Renault is in a very similar place as Rick, where he's become somebody who's, I think this is more, he's become somebody who pretends that he doesn't have any convictions and he'll go where the wind blows. But the moment his friend is willing to do the right thing, he's willing to follow. And that's where I think that this movie makes Rick it does make Rick the hero by being willing to let go of what he personally wants for what's better for everyone involved, not just him.
I sound like such a cynic in saying this, but I feel like, in some sense, I feel like Rick kind of did the bare minimum when he just sends Laszlo on the plane on his way and he doesn't really have to get very involved.
Well, but I think, he is blessed by the fact that Renault also makes the turn, right? I mean, we're speaking of this because we know how it ends, but in the story, Rick thinks he's going to be arrested by Renault and put in prison and or killed, right? So when he's doing this without the knowledge that that turn is going to happen for Renault. And it's only because Renault says, round up the usual suspects, that they are both able to then get away. And they have, as they're walking away, Renault's like, I know a free French garrison, and they're both willing to get back into the fight, which I think, to me, is very clearly the message of the film, especially, at that time period, right, is that this movie would have been saying to everybody, hey, it's worth giving up those things that you need to give up wherever you are to make it better for us to be able to win this war. And that these people do actually have some control of the way things turn out. That one decision could actually turn the tide of the war, right? And I think that's where, to me, that's where the film leaves us, is that by letting Laszlo go, we've already seen the way that he's able to inspire people very quickly to be the best versions of themselves. And I think that the film it does leave us in a place where it's saying, yeah, Rick not only made the right decision, but he's also been inspired to be the better version of himself that he hasn't been in too long.
It's almost like, I don't know, kind of like a Rocky moment, like, get up, you might seem helpless, but get up and keep on fighting. Yeah.
Yes. No, I think that's a great point, I think what this is that, he had been knocked down, and he had been knocked down for quite a long time. I mean, it's years, right? Because, I think they leave, in the film, of course, they leave Paris once it's occupied, which is very early in the war. And here, I think the film, December 1941, so it's been a couple of years where he's really become this kind of cynical, jaded character. And it's just interesting to hear you say that, because I'm surprised, because to me, I feel like the movie is the very antithesis of what you're saying.
Well, maybe it's just because it focuses on such specific characters. Like, you kind of, I guess I was hungry for some sort of bigger resolution to the war. And of course, we know the war ends and we know the outcome and whatnot, but they didn't when the film was made, right? There is no resolution yet. We know what the outcome is, and obviously it's not going to be in the film because the war was ongoing when the film was made. So there is no resolution. I think I was just hungry for some resolution to the bigger issues in the film.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the thing, because, this film is full of moral dilemmas, right? And I think one of the biggest moral dilemma that gets asked by the young couple's wife. And basically it's the same thing that Ilsa and Rick are struggling with, right? Which is it okay to do the wrong thing for the right reasons? Or should you just do the right thing for the right reasons? Or,
I think people's temperaments towards such things vary greatly. There are ends justifies the means kind of people, and there are do no wrong at any cost kind of people.
Right, exactly. I mean, because you've got this young couple, and she's willing to sleep with Captain Renault secretly.
Yeah, and Richard Nixon wasn't that bad, by the way. While we're at it, right?
to get away, and. It's, again, we see Rick, we see a part of his character there where he keeps her from having to make this terrible choice by making sure that, he wins the money, and, they're able to be able to get away. But I mean, the whole question of even what Rick does for Laszlo in the end by lying to him and telling him, she came and, I let her pretend, she pretended and I let her pretend, it's one of those questions, which I think is one of the biggest questions too. Is it okay to tell a white lie if it leads to something better? Right. And that kind of moral ambiguity in a film is not something that we'd seen a lot of at that time period, which is one of the reasons I think that makes this movie something to which people watching today can kind of connect with, because it's not cut and dry, right? It's not really black and white what we're playing with here. We're playing in all sorts of shades of gray.
I mean, Matt, are you saying that, prior to this film, we see very, very few instances of, you basically said it, shades of gray characters, but, characters that are not as praiseworthy as you might expect from a major Hollywood picture. I mean, you know, prior to this were characters in films. You know more about the history of film than I do. Were characters more idealized to some extent?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so like this film itself kind of ran into the Production Code Administration, you know, Hollywood's self-censoring body. Mm-hmm. And they didn't like the idea that Captain Renault would be extorting sexual favors, you know, for visa applications. They didn't like the implication that Rick and Ilsa had slept together in the movie.
It strikes me as pretty racy for a 1940s film.
Exactly. And so, you know, they even altered some of the lines where they, you know, explicitly talk about Rick and Ilsa's sexual relationship and implied kind of implicitly in the film rather than explicitly that, you know, when she comes up to meet him in his room there at Rick's, that, you know, they have sex.
Well, it's like early rock and roll lyrics, right? I mean, all the interesting stuff is written between the lines, not explicitly.
Exactly, which, you know, in some ways I think makes the film better. But just because that kind of subtlety is, I think, more enjoyable to be able to then kind of read between the lines, right? Instead of just having everything explicitly put before you. And I think they do a great job of doing that. But now, I mean, this is definitely a movie that kind of was a challenge to the time, again, because of the things that these characters are doing. And I do think it's because we're, you know, in a world full of gray. And no, I don't just mean the black and white that the film is produced in. It's the characters themselves. But I also think it speaks to, you know, where people were in the middle of World War II, right? You know, when you think about and you watch or read about what, you know, the men on the front lines of World War II needed to do, right? It's not always pretty. It's ugly, as war always is. And there were lots of places, you know, that people were having to make moral compromises in ways they wouldn't have wanted to. You know, heck, I mean, this, of course, they didn't know this was coming, and I'm only thinking about this because this year we're going to have Oppenheimer come out, right? Which is going to be a film which talks about the biggest moral dilemma of World War II, the creation of the atomic bomb and using it. And so I think that this movie sets the stage for the type of questions that not only were being asked, but would continue to be asked, not only during this war, but as we move forward, which is another reason I think, again, it's something that people can still watch and be like, oh, this still seems to have relevance, right?
Well, the film seems to do a good job of just portraying the fact that people will go to extreme lengths in times of hardship. And, you know, we'd all like to think we'd take the moral high ground in times of hardship. But in reality, if any of us were put in an equally hopeless situation, you know, we'd probably fall right in line with compromising our ideals to some extent too. We're as flawed as anyone. So just shows the raw humanity of people in hard times.
Which I think is definitely a huge moral dilemma in the film. You know, what will you do to survive? Mm-hmm. And what can you live with? You know, again, it's funny. It reminds me of you know, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, you know, where Sisko says, yeah, I can live with it. I can live with it, you know?
Well, I think we talked about this a little bit last time when we were talking about Braveheart, that there are kind of two worldviews you might have about humans' natural state. One is that, you know, humans are generally genteel and get along and social, and that's our natural state. Or it's a war of everyone against everyone. And when society degrades, you know, which path do we choose? Do we fall back into some agrarian utopian kind of state of nature, or do we fall into kind of a Thomas Hobbesian war of everyone against everyone, fear-based state of nature? to me, seems like Casablanca seems, if Braveheart assumed the former, that we have these innate natural rights and whatnot, I think this movie probably assumes the latter, that left to our own devices, humans will degrade into a war of everyone against everyone.
I think that you're hitting on half of it. I think that, to me, that it not only says that, but that the natural inclination is to do what we see Rick and Renault doing, which is basically become cynical, jaded, and just go with the wind. Whereas the thing that humans can do, which they don't always do, is very actually choose the better angels of our nature, right? To in many ways, to choose against our nature, which is to do the hard thing, which is the right thing, regardless of the cost, which is exactly why I think that Rick in the film, in his moral dilemma, comes up with what he does, knowing very well that the moment that plane leaves, he could be arrested and therefore executed within hours. But he's willing to do it because he believes it to be the best thing for the rest of the world, not just his own, selfish gratifications of, being able to be with the woman that he loves and will probably feels like he would never be able to replace.
I'm just thinking through this thought right now, but I was mentioning that the film reminds me of Thomas Hobbes's State of Nature, War of Everyone Against Everyone, and what Hobbes thought that people do in that situation is form social contracts. I won't kill you if you won't kill me, and I won't steal your food if you don't steal my food, and that's kind of what's going on in Casablanca to some extent. Rick is making deals behind the scenes and forming partnerships, and who's allied with whom, and it's like a proto social contract in the middle of all this chaos. Fascinating.
Which at the same time, those contracts, as you watch throughout the movie, can easily be broken, and easily be turned against, which I think is actually something that's really important about the film. And I think it shows I think honestly, this film kind of shows the limitations of that type of philosophy. Because I think it is naturally overcome by people just living out what they want and being willing to do whatever it takes to get it, right?
Yeah, and I think that's why Hobbes thought that in order to, you have to have a strong authority to enforce a social contract. He was a monarchist, right? So it's what the Nazis do. The Nazis are the ones to enforce the social contracts in Casablanca.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what's interesting here. And I'm glad that you brought up our discussion about Braveheart, because I also think one of the other dilemmas in the film comes down to the question of, freedom. And Renault is pretending as if he's actually free when he's really chained by the whims of the Germans. And I almost get the sense that at the end of the film as well, he's been inspired to truly be free, to let go of this pretend freedom that he has and actually live true freedom, which is exactly what we talked about in Braveheart. And it seems as though, too, Rick is willing to lay down his life for that ideal as well, which is an interesting place to leave these two characters, as they walk off into the fog. And it seems as though, their lives are irreparably changed by the choices that Rick made here, but for the better, right?
To me, it seems like Braveheart is freedom writ large. I mean, you get the freedom scream at the end of the movie, whereas here it's more like, Rick is subversive in his freedom, and he still controls the roulette wheel, even if he doesn't have his freedom scream at the end of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely the case. That there is, it's
how can you reclaim little bits of freedom, right?
Yes,
instead of freedom writ
exactly.
large. Yeah,
100% agree with you. It is a different type of it's not as incredibly explicit. but I think
it's the kind of freedom. It's the kind of freedom. I don't know, a Jewish person in a German concentration camp might have, right? You know, they might beat you and kill you, but at least you can keep your dignity to some extent.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask you. You know, obviously, this film is full of people who are big actors at the time, and so I wanted to ask you what you thought of, especially. We had talked a little bit about Rick Blaine and Humphrey Bogart, but what did you think of his performance? And of course, you know, as we've been talking, you know, the turn then that he makes in the film.
You know, I'm not sure what I have to say about his turn in the film, but I really enjoyed Humphrey Bogart's acting. I don't know much about his acting. I don't think I've seen much else of his acting, actually. But for me personally, I always kind of wanted to own a coffee shop or maybe a bar by extension. And I like, you know, random casts of people coming and going. In fact, I just spent 2 weeks in Ashland, Oregon, hanging out in a little pub called Oberon's. And it was very much like Rick's, just, you know, all crazy cast of characters coming and going every night. And I love the cosmopolitanness of it. So I thought he did an interesting job of portraying the duality of, you know, liking the social scene he created, but also feeling jaded and disinterested and somehow separate from it. And I think he did a good job of portraying that duality, and something I can relate to, you know, as someone who might like to own a bar or a coffee shop one day. Yeah,
you know, I think I've seen Bogart in many things, you know, A Maltese Falcon, The African Queen, and plenty of other films, Sabrina.
I haven't seen any of those, to be honest. Yeah.
There you go. You got a new list. But
new direction for the 602 Club, yeah.
I think he's phenomenal here because, especially when we talk about the flashback sequence and the way in which he is able to portray a character who is completely different than the Rick we've already been seeing, is great. And what's interesting then is to watch him slowly tap back into those things throughout the rest of the film, so that by the time we get to the end, we already have seen a version of Rick that he's moving back towards. And basically it's the, you know, that part of himself and that part of his heart is being unlocked again. And, you know, even says it to Elsa, you know, we had lost Paris until you came and we got it back. And that getting it back is actually something that allows him to let go of her, let go of what he wants, and do what's better for the greater good. And I think his portrayal in that is phenomenal. I mean, his scene, of course, too, at the bar where he's just, you know, of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she had to walk into mine. His acting there, I think, is great.
I guess I'm of two minds about the flashback sequence, the montage. I mean, on the one hand, I feel like it gives us this insight into his character. Like, it's almost like the baseline for his character that he needs to return to because he's become jaded. On the other hand, it seems to make him almost overly sentimental, overly romantic, to the point that it might undercut the political force of his character at the end of the movie. You know, is he acting out of romance, or is he acting out of the common good? You know, which is it?
I think that's why they talk about in the film, you know, that he had been a part of other, you know, underdog stories. And underdog, you know, he had run guns into Ethiopia, you know, fought in the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War. And, you know, he talks about he gets paid well for that, right? But I think that's him covering up for the fact that he's always been somebody who seems to have a good indication of what is right and wrong, and you know, what's good and evil, and what side to be on, right? So I think that by putting that with the flashback, it allows us to have a full picture of who this character used to be and what he's lost, and then watch him slowly regain that. And to me, I find him to be to be a moving performance. I think he really sinks his teeth into it and gives it his all in a way that, to me, you know, even today, I think still holds up. Which leads me to our leading lady in Ingrid Bergman. And I really wondered what you thought of Ilsa, because, you know, as well, I think in this film, she has to play many different variations of this character, and there's a lot of ups and downs, I feel like, with her performance.
Well, she has to play a different character with Laszlo than she does with Rick, right? She's playing both sides of the fence to some extent as well.
Well, and I was thinking too, to me the scene, and this is one of the reasons I think I love the flashback the most. It's not as much about Rick, I think, to me. When I watch her performance, and you get that moment where they are drinking the champagne together, and they're in the bar, and Sam's playing the piano, and her countenance is completely different. She has completely changed from the character you've seen in the flashback before to who she is now when she's heard and learned, that Laszlo's alive, not dead.
And do you think her character gets the same kind of development that Rick's character gets by the end of the film?
I think that, especially for the time, I think they do a pretty phenomenal job of the characterization for her. I think that she's a pretty complex character. And I think what's fascinating in the end as well, I think she also has to make the choice, right? Is she going to do what is better for everyone or just for her?
Mm-hmm.
And she makes the choice to go with Laszlo, right?
Well, this is the when Harry met Sally conversation, right?
Exactly.
To some extent.
And I think that, I think it is not about her not just about following duty, but I think like Rick, it does come down to her being willing to do the right thing for everyone, not just her. She had told Rick, I can't think anymore. You have to do the thinking for all of us. And in the end, I think she's also doing the thinking, not just for herself, not just for Rick, but I think she understands the importance of who her husband is, right? And what he can inspire others to do. And therefore, she's willing to give up a desire that she has for the greater good. And I think that's she does a really good job of that. And
I mean, despite the self-interest that permeates the film.
Exactly. Which I think that's the thing about this movie that I love. Of course, I already mentioned. This movie is all about the idea of letting go of selfishness and becoming more selfless, right? And I think there's something really special about that, and I think those two performances specifically play that out. Now, Paul Henreid, who's playing Victor Laszlo, I think the thing that I'm most impressed by him is that he doesn't play an idiot. Like, he knows what's going on. And I'm actually struck by it at the end of the film, and I'm wondering if you agree with his performance, that I think he absolutely knows what's been happening.
I have to say, I was particularly impressed with the Laszlo character and the acting by extension. I mean, there's an element of it's in the script, right? So he gets one of the good lines, which is, I forget the exact line, but it's something to the effect of, what am I going to do? Am I going to sit here and, rot in Casablanca? Or am I going to go put myself out there in danger and do what I can? And that's what I'm going to do. I forget exactly how he phrases it, but, he refuses just to be a passive observer of history. Is going to take his part in it, even if he has to put himself at risk to do it. And I'm not sure if it's the acting that portrays that or the lines, but actually, speaking of him, I had this is just a bit of a stretch, but his acting reminded me a lot of Kelsey Grammer, to the point where I was thinking to myself that Kelsey Grammer is to some extent channeling this performance in his portrayal of Frasier.
Oh man, that's a really interesting pull, and I like that. But I can see it, actually, in the way that Kelsey Grammer kind of... Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that a lot. But no, I'm glad you liked it. And I think, you mentioned just the writing with the character, right? And I think that's one of the reasons, of course, that this movie has continued to be a standout to people. It's just that the writing for these characters is incredible. I mean... I was laughing out loud at some of the lines in the film, and one of my absolute favorites is not one that's like one of the most famous, but it comes from Ferrari when he's like, as the leader of all illegal activities in Casablanca, I'm an influential and respected man. And it's like, that's a hysterical line. But that's just the type of writing that we get with these characters. And I think, Claude Rains is Captain Renault. I think especially Sidney Greenstreet as Signor Ferrari, Peter Lorre even as Ugarte, the Strassa. All of these,
I like these characters. I know people like this. I know people that they want to be respected out in public, but they want their hand in all the dirty dealing.
Yes,
and they're some of the most interesting people you meet, right?
Exactly. No, So I think that's the other thing about this film is that, and we mentioned, we don't talk a lot of Star Trek on the show, but this movie reminds me so much of the way in which there are a lot of characters in this film that become memorable. But they have very small parts. And you think of them as having bigger parts in the film, even though they don't. It's the same way Deep Space Nine is with a lot of its side characters. We come out of that show thinking that Garak is a much bigger character in the series, but he's only in like 20 episodes. Right? And I think that that's where, the way in which these characters are portrayed because of the actual actors involved, and they give them these personalities that they bring such gravitas to it that you can't forget them. But it's on top of the lines then that they get to say, which create such classic characters.
Well, it's no accident that you thought of Quarks and I thought of Quarks, but yeah, and this is something you probably know the answer to that I don't know the answer to, but is Quarks actually based on Rix to some extent? Is that a conscious choice?
Man, I think I'd have to go back and read and I have it, of course, the companion that Terry Erdman wrote. And I would guess that somewhere along the way, and you probably even find it faster in Memory Alpha if you just look up Quarks. And I can't imagine it was not a part of the thought process, right? Because, the writers of Star Trek always knew so much history of film, and they were pulling from so many things. So no, it had to be. So I wanted to ask you too. This is the first time you've seen this movie, but what did you think of just the look of the film, the noir nature of it, the way it's shot, the play with shadow and light, and of course, which is so important in a black and white film.
What it reminded me of, actually, because of the high contrast levels in the film, it's not just a black and white film, it's a black and white film, high levels of contrast in the film. Reminds me of like an Ansel Adams photograph. Everyone was taking photos of nature, but Ansel Adams heightened the contrast and had a unique look, and that's why he was so well known. And I think the heightened contrast plays to the moral issues in the film. It plays to the dark versus light. It plays to the and it's not like it's all shot that way. There are scenes where the contrast is reduced, and maybe those are the moral gray area scenes. I haven't thought about that in detail, but it'd be interesting to go back and pay attention to which scenes in the film had the highest levels of contrast and which didn't, and whether that matches up with the gray areas, the moral gray areas that you were describing.
I think that's a great pull, actually, Zach, from your first time watching this film, because as I'm thinking through the film, which I've seen many a times, right? I think absolutely that there are places, and specifically where the contrast is lowered, and it's mainly in the scenes with Rick and Ilsa.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that there is that moral ambiguity being played out. And then there are other scenes where you see, like you said, the heightened contrast between shadow and light. And so I 100% think that you're onto something with that. And
yeah, it's not merely an aesthetic quality. There's a moral quality to it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right on target with that. And so, and I loved your pull of Ansel Adams. I've always loved his photography. I think, who doesn't, right? It's gorgeous photography. And it was by pulling out that contrast that he was able to bring to life in black and white the beauty of nature, even without seeing it in color. And the drama of even a still picture. Exactly. 100%. And that, I think that's one of the things as well, when I'm thinking of the look of this film, it feels like one of those movies that you could almost pull out any still from and it be like that. And so I think that, which is another thing to which I think is why this movie feels classic in that sense, when you feel like you could almost take out any scene and almost any still from the film and just put it up on your wall and it would be art. Even though, like we said at the beginning, they're not trying to make art here. They're just trying to make another movie. And it turns into that. I think it's one of those, might be one of the most felicitous things to happen in Hollywood, right? Is when that accidentally happens.
I sit and I think about, what are the things in human life that really reveal human nature in all of its rawness. And one is war and the other is probably being in a bar. And here we get both. And, we get the heightened contrast that really reveals the rawness.
Exactly. Of it. Yeah. No, I love it. I'm so glad you pulled that out, though. And honestly, I feel like an idiot that I'd never thought about that before.
Well, never having seen it, that's something that stood out to me immediately. It's just that I was noticing this is not just a black and white film. This is a very black and white film.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this is one of those things where, for me, so many times, I'm very guilty of this, where I'm so, specifically focused on, story and character and thematic elements and stuff. I do, in all honesty, just sometimes miss some of those type of subtleties. And, I was able to pick up on some things rewatching the film again myself here, which I was glad of. But, I love it because I think it just goes to show like how different people watch film in the first place. And that's what makes, podcasting about film so fun in the first place,
I think I had to take a totally the opposite approach as you. I think I have no ability to remember the minutia of the plot or the characters, but I did kind of absorb the overall gestalt of the film.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I'm makes for, I think, an exciting conversation. I wanted to ask you just before we wrap up here, because, the score here is done by Max Steiner, who classic film composer from that time period, did King Kong, did Gone with the Wind. We talked about the idea of him, using the French national anthem is kind of a motif throughout the entire work. I found it most interesting learning that he did not actually want to use as time goes by. He wanted to do his own composition, and they couldn't because Bergman had already cut her hair short for her next role and then couldn't reshoot the scenes. So what did you end up thinking of, the score here? And of course, all of the ways in which they had weaved in that popular music of the time to really create an incredible soundtrack.
Boy, I'm not sure what to say about it, to be honest. I think, maybe I mentioned this before. I forget which film we were talking about, but to some extent, I think the measure of a good score is the extent to which it fades into the background. Like it adds to the feel of the movie, but doesn't trample on anything. And I think the score did a good job at that for me. Definitely picked up on the French theme. I thought that worked very well. I mean, who doesn't want to shout "Vive la France" when the Germans are taking over, right? So I think that was really effective. In terms of the incorporation of popular music, I mean, I don't know. This is the era of big band music, and to me, it just struck me as kind of par for the course that a film from this era would have some 1940s popular music in it. But yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about it, though. I wanted to play it again, Sam. I like the music.
I think. For me, I love the score here. I wish that, they don't actually have a recording of the score without a lot of the dialogue in it. Because, they didn't make soundtracks to films the way we do these days. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is a really good soundtrack specifically because of the use of, that French national anthem, which is so iconic. And of course, reminds us almost of like 1812 Overture by Tchaikovsky kind of feel, which is beautiful. But I think, this is a film which is so known for the idea that the song As Time Goes By actually brings. And I think it's again a really beautiful and wonderful accident that allows them to not be able to replace that song as the love song here, because so much this movie is about time going by and what it does to us, how love can change, how our situations can change, and all of those type of things. And so I think the song alone
harkens back to the waiting at the beginning.
Exactly.
At the beginning of the movie. Exactly.
100%.
I mean, time goes by in the film. I mean, we see a montage from the past and things happen, but it also goes by really slowly in Casablanca.
Exactly. So I'm really glad that they weren't able to change it. I think it works so much better in the film. So sure people can guess what I might rate this film, but I'm fascinated to see, with the conversation that we have had, where you're going to land with your first viewing of Casablanca.
You know, it's never going to be my favorite movie, maybe just because it's old. I hate to say that, but I have no complaints about the movie. I thought it was really enjoyable. If anything, it made me hungry to watch it again. Because I know I missed plot points and I know I missed character details because I did literally only watch it the one time. So I think because of this hunger to watch it again, there are thematic elements that really speak to me, like the nihilism inherent to a wartime period and whatnot. Not to mention the incredible acting that we talked about and the incredibly memorable lines. I'm going to give this, let's call it 4 out of 5 bottles of, is it Vichy water? Is there a bottle of Vichy water in the movie?
I love that. I think that's phenomenal. I think one of my favorite things to hear is that you want to revisit the film, which I think is a hallmark of a good movie for the most part, right? If you didn't like the movie, you wouldn't want to revisit it. And so I'm glad that's the case. This is my favorite movie of all time. This is also what I think is the best film of all time. I think it's just so wonderfully classic in all of the right ways, and I love rewatching it. I'm actually going to be showing it to some of our young adults in our church group that have never seen it, because I talk about it all the time, and they've been asking. So I was like, okay, well, we'll finally do a movie night then. And so I'm going to be very interested in their reactions. But on top of that, one of the things that I'm glad about with the way my parents brought me up was that we didn't watch a lot of newer stuff when I was young, but we did watch all of these old classic black and white films. And I do understand for many people that it's difficult to get into them sometimes because these films are so much about dialogue and following the dialogue for the character development. And it's not about lots of big action, right? Like you said, they're much more like stage plays. And I'm just eternally grateful, to my parents for that, because I love that I have this appreciation for these older movies. And I think it's allowed me to really be able to experience some great classic films. So, that's just a shout out to my parents there, because, it's something that I've really appreciated over the years as I've continued to dig into, black and white films and, films from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And so, I love it.
This is just a little point, but you were saying that this is, to some extent, the best film ever. And it actually did strike me as one of the most cinematic films ever. I mean, almost by definition, but cinematic in the sense of, like, one of the things that jumps out to me is the transition between scenes are incredibly slow fades. It's dramatic in its composition.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great point. I 100% agree with you in that. And
like the very definition of a cinematic slow fade, that is this movie.
Yes. No, I think you kind of nailed it in that point. So no, I'm glad you said that. So, cause I really agree with you in that. And so, Zach, if people want to catch up with you, maybe they've got some recommendations for other old films that they think you should check out, where would they be able to find you?
Yeah, there's two good places to find me. One is on Twitter. My handle is just my name, @Zachary Fruhling. You can always contact me there. And you can always also find me on my website, zacharyfruhling.com, where I tend to write about philosophy, but I also write about philosophy and film to some degree.
And you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. There seems to be a new one every week, but I'm most active on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vero under the name MattRushing02. You can also find me, of course, here all over the network outside the 602 Club with Warp 5, The Orb, Literary Treks, Saddle Up, and The Artificial Tango. And you'll also find me over on the Nerd Party Network with a couple of shows. One is Owl Post that I did with Dre Kaufman, and we talked through all of the chapters of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And I do an Aggressive Negotiations with the great John Mills as we talk about Star Wars each and every week. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll always have Paris.